The cold fog rolling off the Atlantic always made the brick streets of Briarcliff slick, and Maeve Barlow walked faster than her thin shoes preferred. She clutched a heavy basket of lace alterations against her side, using it as a shield against the damp wind that swept up from the harbor. Her dark woolen cloak had been mended at the hem so many times the fabric was thin as parchment, and she kept her eyes on the pavement to avoid the glances of the wealthy women passing in their warm velvet coats. In the 3 years since her father had died, Maeve had learned that the easiest way to navigate the wealthy coastal town was to remain completely unnoticed. Being invisible was far better than receiving the polite pity of people who used to know her family before their money vanished. She hurried toward the center of the town square, knowing Mrs. Higgins expected the finished dresses at the shop by 4 o'clock, when a movement near the stone fountain caught her attention. An elderly man stood at the corner of the square, turning in a slow, hesitant circle, while one pale hand pressed against his forehead, as if he were trying to hold an escaping thought in place. He wore a coat of exceptionally fine dark cloth, beautifully tailored but buttoned completely askew, suggesting he had dressed in a state of deep confusion or great haste. His long hair was pure white, contrasting sharply with his unusually pale skin, and his fine hat sat crookedly on his head. He looked like a person who had walked out of a familiar room and suddenly found himself stranded in an entirely foreign country without understanding how he crossed the border. Most of the townspeople walked right past him, ignoring his distress entirely. A young man in a bright blue coat even laughed aloud, muttering a joke to his companion about the old fellow indulging in too much wine before noon. Maeve felt a familiar tightness in her jaw as she watched the crowd bypass the old man. She did not know that her decision to stop, to step out of the rushing crowd and approach a vulnerable stranger whom everyone else ignored, would completely alter the direction of her life. She stepped closer, moving into his line of sight slowly, so she would not startle him in his state of confusion. She asked him gently if he was lost, or if he needed someone to help him find his way home. The man turned his head toward her, revealing eyes of a pale, clouded blue that seemed entirely blank for a long moment, showing no recognition of the street or the town square around them. Then, as her calm voice seemed to cut through the mental fog that gripped him, the tension in his face eased slightly. He pressed 2 long fingers against his temple, explaining that he had intended to walk to the Grand Library near the upper cliffs, but the buildings and the avenues looked completely unfamiliar to him now. He looked around at the brick storefronts, the passing carriages, and the low gray sky with an underlying expression of quiet dread. Maeve assured him softly that he had merely turned down the wrong street, explaining that the library was a 10-minute walk in the opposite direction, back past the stone chapel he had likely passed earlier. The man gave a slow nod, though his eyes still carried a visible trace of fear, the specific distress of a proud individual who has suddenly realized his own mind cannot be fully trusted. He murmured that it was foolish of him to lose his bearings so easily. Maeve countered his words immediately, stating that the winding streets of Briarcliff could confuse anyone who did not spend every day walking them. She meant the comfort sincerely, recognizing the vulnerability of his position. The man remarked that he was certainly no stranger to the town, speaking with a subtle note of deep authority beneath his confusion that made Maeve look at him more closely. Even with his crooked hat and trembling hands, he carried himself with the posture of a person who was accustomed to rooms falling silent whenever he entered them. Yet his fingers continued to shake faintly at his sides, and his focus seemed to drift away like a candle flame flickering in a sudden draft of wind. Maeve offered to walk with him as far as the stone chapel, claiming she was heading in that exact direction herself. This was not true, as the detour would cost her 15 minutes, and Mrs. Higgins never tolerated late deliveries from her seamstresses. She made the offer anyway, because the old man's struggle to maintain his quiet dignity moved her deeply. The stranger thanked her, offering his arm with an old-fashioned courtesy that seemed to steady his balance the moment she took it. He remarked that young people were rarely patient with elderly men who lost their way in public. Matching her pace to his slower stride, Maeve began to talk about simple, ordinary things to keep his mind anchored. She spoke of the coming rain, a stray dog that had disrupted the morning market, and the new window displays at the bakery, providing him with easy details to hold on to. He answered her remarks readily, and by degrees the trembling in his hands began to stop. By the time the tall towers of the stone chapel rose into view through the coastal fog, the old man was walking with a firm, natural step that showed no trace of his earlier hesitation. Maeve stopped, pointing toward the wide avenue that led directly to the library entrance. The old man turned to face her fully, his eyes clear and entirely present, as he studied her face with an intensity that made her wonder if she had spoken out of turn. He asked her directly why she had chosen to stop when a dozen respectable citizens had passed him without slowing their steps. Maeve considered the question before replying that she knew exactly what it felt like to stand in a crowded street and feel completely invisible to the world. She added that it seemed like a very small thing to ensure he was seen instead. A deep emotion moved behind his pale eyes, and he pressed her gloved hand between both of his, calling her a rare person before turning toward the avenue. Maeve watched him walk away with a straight back, entirely different from the confused figure she had found by the fountain. She suddenly remembered her basket of mending and hurried toward the dress shop, already late and certain she would never think of the encounter again. She was completely wrong, though she would not discover the truth for nearly 2 weeks while she returned to her quiet life. She spent her days sewing in the small rented rooms she shared with her mother, convinced that her brief interaction with the white-haired stranger was simply a momentary event on a gray afternoon. 12 days passed before the quiet routine of Maeve's household was completely disrupted by the arrival of a massive, dark carriage. The vehicle bore a polished silver crest on the door and stopped directly outside the modest wooden house where Maeve lived with her widowed mother. A tall footman wearing a pristine velvet uniform stepped down and knocked firmly on their front door, creating a sharp sound that made Maeve's mother look up from her knitting with immediate alarm. Maeve opened the door, and the footman asked formally for Miss Maeve Barlow, stating that he had been sent by the master of Cresthaven Lodge. He delivered a request for her to attend the estate immediately regarding a matter of great importance. Maeve stared at the servant, replying that he must have the wrong address, since she was not acquainted with anyone who lived in the grand mansions on the outer cliffs. The footman explained patiently that his master had given very specific instructions to locate the exact young woman who had assisted an elderly gentleman with white hair on the corner of the town square during the heavy fog 2 weeks ago. Maeve felt her breath catch as she realized the stranger she had helped belonged to the most powerful and reclusive family in the entire region. The servant added that the carriage was entirely at her disposal whenever she was ready to depart. Maeve's mother gripped her daughter's sleeve, her voice trembling as she asked what such wealthy people could possibly want with a poor seamstress. Maeve admitted she had no idea, though her mind immediately returned to the memory of the old man's intense gaze and his strangely pale skin. She went to her small bedroom to dress in her best gown, which was a simple gray wool that had been let out at the seams twice and mended neatly at the cuffs. She joined the footman outside, stepping into the luxurious interior of the carriage, as it turned toward the winding roads that led out of the town and up into the steep cliffs. Cresthaven Lodge was situated 20 minutes beyond the edge of Briarcliff, positioned on a high bluff that overlooked the gray ocean. The long driveway was lined with ancient pine trees, leading to a massive facade of dark stone that looked far too large for ordinary human purposes. Maeve had seen the grand estate from a distance during her Sunday walks, but she had never expected to walk through the front entrance. A butler received her with an expressionless courtesy that revealed nothing of his thoughts regarding her plain clothes, leading her through a vast hallway floored in black and white marble. They walked past tall portraits of pale ancestors, whose painted eyes seemed to follow her with aristocratic disapproval, finally entering a bright morning room filled with the pale light of late winter. The elderly man rose from a high-backed chair near the roaring fireplace, looking completely different than he had during their first encounter. He was perfectly dressed in a tailored coat, his long white hair combed neatly, and his pale blue eyes were sharp and entirely focused on her face. He greeted her with real warmth, expressing his gratitude that she had accepted the sudden invitation. Maeve offered a careful curtsy, admitting that she had not understood the formal summons, and expressing regret for not introducing herself properly during their meeting in the square. The old man smiled faintly, introducing himself as Lord Arthur. He explained that the title mattered very little compared to the fact that he was the elder patriarch of the family that ruled the region, and that his family had been thrown into an absolute panic on the day she found him wandering alone. He admitted that he had escaped his private physicians during a temporary period of severe mental confusion. He looked at her seriously, noting that he had appeared frightened, disoriented, and foolish on a public street. Yet she had not laughed or called the town guards to remove the embarrassment. He emphasized that she had given him her arm, her time, and her respect, without asking for his name or expecting any reward for her trouble. Maeve replied that she had done nothing extraordinary, claiming that any decent person would have offered the same assistance. Lord Arthur shook his head, stating that after living for many decades, he had grown very expert at recognizing true decency, precisely because it was so uncommon. He explained that what she offered him on that slick brick street was the one thing missing from the lives of powerful individuals who were constantly surrounded by people, yet remained entirely isolated. Maeve stood in the vast room, feeling embarrassed by a sincerity so completely unguarded that it moved her more than any grand royal gesture could have. Before she could compose a proper reply, Lord Arthur asked if she could be persuaded to visit him again on a regular basis, clarifying that he did not wish to place any obligation upon her. He confessed that he had grown thoroughly tired of the constant management of his worried doctors and structured servants who treated him like a fragile object. He stated that Maeve had spoken to him as if he were merely a man who had lost his way, which was exactly what he had been in that moment. Maeve looked at the loneliness hidden beneath his dignified expression, recognizing a feeling she had carried herself for 3 years. She answered softly that she would like to visit him very much, and Lord Arthur smiled, thanking her for her continued patience. The weekly visits to Cresthaven Lodge quickly became a settled part of Maeve's life over the following months, transforming her quiet routine. Every Thursday afternoon, the dark carriage arrived at her house to carry her away from her sewing machine and into the quiet, vast halls of the cliffside estate. She would sit with Lord Arthur in the bright morning room, reading historical volumes to him when his eyes grew tired from the light, or listening to his detailed stories of the early days of the country. He spoke of old wars, forgotten treaties, and a wife who had died long ago, speaking of her with a gentle affection that made it seem as though she had merely stepped into the next room. During a rainy afternoon, as the water traced long lines down the window panes, Lord Arthur confessed that his family simply did not know how to handle his failing memory. He noted that they were trained to manage vast properties and political territories, yet they became completely helpless when faced with an old man's mental decline, admitting that his condition frightened them more than any financial crisis. Maeve offered gently that their fear likely came from the fact that a crisis could be reasoned with, while a failing memory could not. The elder lord looked at her with surprise, remarking that she understood a great deal for someone who lived such a quiet life. Maeve shared that she had nursed her own father through a long illness before his death, learning that watching someone you love become less certain of the world was a heartbreaking experience. She added that she had discovered that sometimes the only thing you can do for a person is simply choose to remain by their side. Lord Arthur remained silent for a long moment before reaching over to press her hand, stating that staying was often the entire requirement of love, even though people often imagined it had to be a far grander gesture. Their bond deepened with each visit, built on these quiet moments of shared understanding. Maeve found that the vast mansion no longer intimidated her, as the morning room became a comfortable sanctuary where she could speak openly, without the fear of social judgment. Lord Arthur frequently attempted to offer her gold for her time, but she consistently refused the payment, explaining that his company was a gift that allowed her to escape the repetitive labor of her daily sewing. One afternoon, she accidentally left a worn book of poetry on the side table, an old volume that had belonged to her father, with a spine cracked from many years of reading. When she returned the following week, she found the elder lord looking at the book with an expression of quiet contemplation. He remarked that the simple verses carried a deep sense of solitude, noting that the author seemed to understand the feeling of being alone even when surrounded by a crowded world. Maeve agreed, stating that her father had loved the book for that exact reason, finding comfort in the words during his own difficult times. Lord Arthur set the book down with unusual gentleness, observing that immortals and mortals alike shared the same fundamental need to be truly understood by another soul. Their conversations ranged from deep philosophical questions to the simple events of the town below the cliffs, with Maeve bringing him news of the local markets and shipping docks. Lord Arthur listened to her descriptions of the fishermen and the local shopkeepers with genuine interest, enjoying the connection to the ordinary world that his high status usually denied him. The servants began to notice the positive change in the elder lord's disposition, observing that his periods of confusion occurred far less frequently whenever Maeve was visiting the house. The old butler even thanked Maeve privately one afternoon, stating she had brought a warmth into the estate that had been missing for decades. Despite the growing comfort of her position at Cresthaven Lodge, Maeve remained fully aware of the invisible line that separated her reality from the powerful world of the cliffside nobility. She knew she was a simple human girl, spending brief hours in a realm of timeless wealth and ancient family lines that had controlled the region for generations. She resolved to guard her heart, enjoying the genuine friendship she had formed with Lord Arthur, without expecting the connection to alter her actual standing in society. She was content to be a quiet comfort to an old man who had once been lost in the winter fog. It was during her 6th visit to the estate that the quiet routine of Maeve's afternoons was permanently altered by an unexpected encounter. She entered the morning room expecting to find Lord Arthur alone, but instead found him in conversation with a remarkably tall man who stood with his back to the door. The stranger's posture was exceptionally straight and controlled, radiating an intense, silent authority that immediately filled the vast space of the room. As he turned around to face her, Maeve found herself looking into a pair of sharp, silver eyes that held an expression of intense scrutiny. The man possessed striking white hair that fell neatly around a pale, perfectly sculpted face, creating an appearance that was both breathtaking and deeply intimidating. Maeve recognized the family resemblance instantly, realizing this must be King Dominic, the sovereign ruler of the Nightborn court, of whom Lord Arthur had spoken so often. Lord Arthur smiled from his chair, presenting his grandson with evident pleasure and breaking the sudden silence that had filled the room. Maeve dropped into a deep, careful curtsy, addressing him with the formal title his royal status required. Dominic studied her for a long moment, his silver gaze moving over her plain gray wool dress and her simple basket of mending, with an expression that lay between surprise and calculation. His voice was low and perfectly controlled when he finally spoke, remarking that his grandfather spoke of her so frequently that he had expected to meet someone far more remarkable in appearance. He added immediately that he intended the observation as a compliment to her character rather than an insult to her clothing, though he admitted it might not sound like one. Maeve maintained her composure under his intense gaze, replying calmly that she was uncertain whether to thank him or forgive him for the blunt observation. A faint movement occurred at the corner of Dominic's mouth, not quite a smile, but a close relative of one, as he acknowledged the justice of her response. He confessed that he found himself in her debt, explaining that his grandfather had wandered away from the estate 4 times in the past year, causing immense public embarrassment and requiring massive search parties each time. He noted that the first 3 instances had ended with frantic doctors and political complications, while the fourth had ended with Maeve calmly walking the elder lord to the chapel and asking for nothing in return. Dominic admitted he had spent a considerable amount of time wondering what sort of person would perform such an action without seeking personal gain. Maeve answered simply that she had merely been the person who happened to be walking down the street at the right moment, claiming no special virtue for the deed. Dominic pointed out that she had continued to visit every week since that day, completely refusing the financial compensation his grandfather had offered multiple times. Maeve felt a slight warmth rise in her cheeks, but answered firmly that Lord Arthur was excellent company, and that she did not view their weekly visits as a task to be compensated with gold. The king remained silent, his silver eyes holding hers for a fraction longer than strict politeness demanded, as if he were recalculating his private estimation of her character. Lord Arthur watched the exchange with evident satisfaction, pleased to see his grandson interacting with the young woman who had brought so much comfort to his isolation. Dominic formally thanked her once more for her continued kindness to his family, his tone losing a bit of its initial coldness. Maeve realized that beneath his regal, intimidating exterior, the young king carried a heavy burden of responsibility for his grandfather's well-being and the stability of their ancient house. As the king stepped back to allow her to take her usual seat near the fireplace, Maeve felt a strange, lingering awareness of his presence that did not vanish even after he left the room. Her quiet afternoons reading to Lord Arthur had taken on a new complexity, filled with the knowledge that the powerful ruler of the estate was now watching her actions. She resolved to maintain her simple, honest approach, refusing to let the intimidating nature of the vampire king disrupt the genuine friendship she had formed with his grandfather. Over the following weeks, it became a frequent occurrence for Maeve to find King Dominic present at Cresthaven Lodge during her regular visits to his grandfather. He never arrived by any formal arrangement that Maeve was aware of, always appearing with a plausible reason concerning estate business or family documents that required his personal signature. Yet she began to notice a quiet attentiveness in his manner that extended well past the paperwork he carried, his silver eyes frequently tracking her movements as she read to the elder lord. He did not engage in any traditional form of courtship, maintaining a respectful distance that befitted their vastly different stations in society. One afternoon, when Lord Arthur had dozed off in the middle of a historical discussion, Dominic quietly asked Maeve her opinion on a complex matter regarding the local fishing docks and the town's trade laws. He seemed genuinely startled by the clarity and practical sense of her response, listening closely as she explained how the current regulations affected the poorer residents of the harbor. On another occasion, he noticed the worn copy of poetry she had left on the side table, picking up the small book with an unusual level of care that made Maeve's chest tighten with an unexpected emotion. He turned the volume over in his long, pale fingers, remarking that the author wrote of true solitude with a depth that few men who lived in comfortable drawing rooms could ever match. Maeve noted that her father had inherited the book, along with the habit of reading it, finding comfort in the verses because they accurately reflected the reality of being alone. Dominic set the book down with unusual gentleness, looking at her with an expression that seemed to strip away the polished mask of royalty he usually wore for the world. He confessed quietly that he was rarely ever truly alone due to his position, yet he was very frequently lonely, adding that he had discovered the two conditions were not opposites, despite what the poets claimed. Maeve answered softly that his statement was one of the truest things she had ever heard spoken within the walls of the grand mansion. Dominic did not reply to her comment, but the expression in his silver eyes changed permanently from that afternoon onward, carrying a silent understanding that bridged the vast distance between their different existences. The peaceful rhythm of their weekly interactions was suddenly shattered during the late weeks of winter, when Lord Arthur suffered a severe and sudden relapse of his physical strength. His body became weak overnight, his skin turning a translucent shade of white as a deep exhaustion took hold of his ancient form, terrifying the entire household staff. Maeve refused to leave the elder lord's side when she arrived, establishing a constant vigil in his grand bedroom, while the specialized physicians rushed through the corridors, trying to stabilize his condition. She spent 2 full nights sitting in a hard wooden chair beside his mattress, holding his pale hand whenever he woke up disoriented, and reading to him in a low, steady voice to calm his fears. She ignored her own growing fatigue, remaining present through every difficult hour, because she knew her familiar voice provided the old man with a necessary anchor to reality. In the quiet, gray hour before the third dawn, the heavy bedroom door opened silently to reveal Dominic, who had ridden frantically from the city capital upon receiving the news. He stood in the doorway, his white hair disheveled from the wind and the mud of the road still clinging to his high leather boots as he surveyed the quiet room. He stopped completely when he saw Maeve gently adjusting the heavy blankets over his grandfather's shoulders, her face showing the clear signs of her long, sleepless vigil. Dominic crossed the room with silent steps, standing on the opposite side of the bed to look down at his sleeping grandfather with an expression of intense, unguarded worry. He noted quietly that most individuals in her position would have sent a message and returned to the comfort of their own homes rather than enduring 2 nights in a hard chair for a person who was not their family. Maeve looked across the bed at the white-haired king, answering softly that she did not believe family was solely a matter of blood or ancient lineage. She stated firmly that she believed family was very often a matter of who chose to stay when things became difficult. Dominic stared at her through the long silence that followed her words, his regal composure completely replaced by a deep, powerful emotion he could no longer hide. The silent understanding that passed between the human seamstress and the vampire king in that quiet bedroom permanently shifted the ground beneath their feet. He thanked her in a rough, quiet whisper, his silver eyes conveying a depth of gratitude and affection that set the stage for everything that was to come between them. Lord Arthur recovered his strength slowly over the following weeks, his return to health bringing a renewed sense of relief to the entire Cliffside estate. However, his recovery also brought the return of high society's attention, and rumors regarding the king's unusual regard for a human seamstress began to circulate through the elite circles of the Nightborn court. The wealthy nobles who traditionally held power within the region viewed Maeve with intense suspicion, viewing her regular presence at Cresthaven Lodge as an insult to their traditional bloodlines. The growing tension came to a head during a grand reception that Lord Arthur insisted on holding to celebrate his recovery, inviting Maeve as an honored guest of the family. Maeve attended the gathering, wearing a simple blue muslin dress that she and her mother had sewn together, standing near the edge of the brilliant ballroom as the beautifully dressed nobles watched her with open disapproval. Lady Regina, a beautiful but exceptionally cruel noblewoman who had long expected to secure Dominic's hand in marriage, approached Maeve with a group of her wealthy companions. Regina examined Maeve's modest dress with a showy display of disdain, speaking loudly enough for the surrounding guests to hear every word of her sharp commentary. She remarked mockingly that it was very charitable of the royal family to include a local seamstress in a private celebration, suggesting that Maeve was merely a temporary amusement for a recovering elderly man. She added coldly that an old man's fondness for a pretty face that read to him was a very different thing from a royal family's willingness to receive that face at their table as an equal. The cruel words found their mark precisely, striking at the core fear Maeve had tried to ignore. The worry that her place in the mansion was a fragile, borrowed thing that would vanish the moment it became inconvenient. Maeve maintained her calm dignity, refusing to give Regina the satisfaction of seeing her cry in front of the crowd. She answered evenly that she was simply grateful for the kindness the family had shown her and did not presume to hold any position beyond what they offered. Regina laughed cuttingly, preparing to deliver another insult, when a low, powerful voice cut across the ballroom with a coldness that immediately silenced every conversation in the room. King Dominic stepped through the crowd, his white hair catching the light of the chandeliers, and his silver eyes flashing with a dangerous anger that made the surrounding nobles step back in alarm. He took his position directly beside Maeve, addressing Regina with a chilling level of formality that sent a wave of tension through the entire space. He demanded to know exactly what quality of Maeve's character Regina found so objectionable, asking if it was her honesty, her courage, or the fact that she had sat through 2 sleepless nights at his grandfather's bedside, while the noble ladies of the court merely sent flowers. Regina's composure faltered completely as she stammered an excuse, but Dominic cut her off, stating firmly that he would not tolerate such disrespect within his house. He declared openly to the entire room that Maeve's birth was modest and her fortune was small, but she possessed a genuine goodness that he had failed to find in any grand drawing room. He commanded the assembled court to extend Maeve the exact courtesy they usually reserved for wealth and titles, making it clear that his regard for her was permanent and absolute. The silence that followed his speech was complete, with the wealthy nobles staring in shock at the king's public defense of a human worker. Maeve looked up at Dominic, her eyes stinging with tears caused by his fierce, unguarded loyalty, rather than the humiliation Regina had intended. He offered his arm to Maeve, guiding her away from the staring crowds and out toward the quiet terrace that overlooked the dark, moonlit ocean. Out in the cool night air, away from the judgment of the court, Dominic looked down at her with an expression of soft, unguarded honesty that she had never seen before. He apologized for the cruelty she had endured, admitting he should have spoken sooner to protect her from the malice of his court, while Maeve assured him that his actions had redefined everything for her. The morning after the grand reception brought a new atmosphere of clarity to the estate, with the rumors of the ballroom confrontation settling into a quiet acceptance among the servants. Lord Arthur summoned Maeve to the morning room early in the afternoon, greeting her with a joyful expression that showed no trace of his past illness. He expressed his complete approval of his grandson's actions, noting that he had never seen Dominic defy the expectations of the noble court with such absolute conviction. The elder lord explained that Dominic had carried the immense weight of his royal duty since his youth, always believing that his personal feelings were secondary to the stability of their ancient house. He stated that Maeve had brought a necessary light into the king's isolated existence, teaching him that he was permitted to seek true happiness, rather than merely serving the crown. Lord Arthur gave Maeve his heartfelt blessing, confessing that he had grown thoroughly fond of having her in the house and deeply desired to see her join their family permanently. He warned her with a mischievous twinkle in his pale eyes that Dominic intended to speak with her privately in the gardens that evening, advising her to prepare her heart for the conversation. Maeve thanked him with a warm smile, her anticipation growing as the hours moved steadily toward twilight and the coastal fog began to drift across the cliffs. As the sun set, casting shades of deep blue over the ocean, Maeve walked down the gravel paths of the sprawling gardens behind the mansion. Lanterns flickered among the branches of the ancient trees, illuminating the early spring blossoms and casting a soft glow over the stone terrace where Dominic stood waiting. He turned as she approached, his white hair catching the silver moonlight and his regal posture softening the moment his silver eyes met hers. He admitted with a faint smile that his grandfather had already informed her of his intentions, expressing his amusement at the elder lord's constant interference in their affairs. Dominic became serious, stepping closer until he could look directly into her face, his expression filled with a rare, vulnerable emotion that stripped away his royal authority. He explained that he did not possess the grand, poetic words that human suitors might use, as he had been trained only to speak of law and governance. But he stated with absolute certainty that he could no longer imagine a single hour of his immortal future that did not include her by his side. He noted that she had seen his grandfather when he was lost and invisible on a public street, and in doing so, she had managed to find the king's hidden heart as well. Dominic knelt on the stone path, holding a simple silver ring set with a brilliant white stone that matched the precise color of his hair. He asked Maeve to accept the ring and become his queen, promising to protect her and cherish her through all the years they were given together. He emphasized that he chose her not for political gain or social standing, but for the pure goodness of her soul, which had transformed his isolated life. Maeve felt tears of joy rising to her eyes as she listened to his honest declaration, remembering the long years of feeling invisible after her father's death. She realized that every difficult step of her path, from the slick brick streets to the sleepless nights at the bedside, had led her directly to this moonlit terrace. She whispered her acceptance, stepping into his embrace, as he slid the silver ring onto her finger, sealing their promise beneath the shelter of the flowering trees. Dominic kissed her gently, his touch conveying a depth of affection that required no grand speeches to clarify its meaning. High above them in the mansion windows, Lord Arthur watched the two figures in the garden with a contented smile, knowing his moment of confusion had brought about the ultimate salvation of his royal house. The wedding took place in the early days of summer, a season when the coastal air turned warm, and the gardens of Cresthaven Lodge were filled with full blossoms. The celebration was entirely unlike anything the Nightbourne court had ever witnessed, successfully bridging the ancient divide between the elegant vampire nobility and the modest human residents of Briarcliff. Maeve's mother sat in the front row of the estate chapel, wiping away tears of pure happiness as she watched her daughter walk down the aisle toward the altar. Maeve wore a stunning white gown, created by Mrs. Higgins, its clean lines reflecting her personal preference for simplicity, while fitting perfectly into the grandeur of the setting. Dominic stood waiting for her, his white hair contrasting beautifully with his dark royal velvet coat, his silver eyes fixed entirely on his bride as she approached. The vows they exchanged were simple and profound, spoken with a quiet intensity that moved everyone present in the crowded chapel to absolute silence. During the wedding dinner that followed, Lord Arthur rose to offer a long toast to the newlyweds, his voice steady and filled with real emotion. He recounted the afternoon he had spent lost and frightened in the winter fog, reminding the guests that a single act of unprompted kindness had completely rewritten the destiny of their royal house. He observed that the truest fortunes are very rarely found in ancient vaults or noble lineages, but in the small, unwatched choices where a person decides to help a stranger simply because it is right. The assembled court applauded with genuine warmth, having fully accepted Maeve as their new queen, after witnessing her strength and dedication during the family's darkest moments. The atmosphere within the grand hall was filled with music and laughter, creating a sense of unity that the region had not experienced in over a century. Maeve stood beside her husband, her hand clasped firmly in his long, pale fingers, feeling a deep sense of permanent peace settle over her heart. As the night deepened, and the guests continued to celebrate inside, Maeve and Dominic slipped away for a quiet moment on the high balcony overlooking the sea. The cool ocean breeze moved through her white veil as they looked out over the dark water, the distant lights of the shipping town twinkling like stars along the horizon. They shared a quiet smile, grateful for the peaceful silence after the long, busy day of formal ceremonies. Dominic pulled her close against his side, his arm offering a familiar, steady warmth that had become her anchor throughout the changes of the past months. He whispered that he was honored to walk the rest of his long journey with her, promising to build a future where both their peoples could live in harmony. Maeve rested her head against his shoulder, her focus fixed on the wide horizon ahead, completely secure in the love they had built together. Looking out at the vast ocean beneath the summer stars, Maeve realized that the future was no longer an uncertain shadow to be feared, but a wide, welcoming road that she would never have to walk alone. The long journey ahead would undoubtedly bring its own unique challenges, yet she felt completely prepared to face whatever came, anchored by the steady love of the white-haired king standing by her side. She understood now that the truest turning points in a person's life rarely arrived with the sound of trumpets or grand public announcements, but appeared instead in the quiet, ordinary choices made on a gray afternoon when no one else was watching. Her decision to stop for a confused stranger had cost her nothing more than a brief delay, yet it had given her a family, a purpose, and a permanent place in a world that had once seemed completely beyond her reach. She looked forward to the years ahead with a gentle heart, knowing that she would spend her days bringing the same warmth and understanding to this ancient court that she had offered on that brick street corner. The cold fog of her past had completely cleared, replaced by a permanent, golden light that would guide them through every tomorrow they were given together.